Schindler from Lowell Observatory, where he does public outreach. We'll be speaking on serendipity and the acquisition of the Slifer spectroscope.
Great. I'm going to try talking from back here also because I have sort of a voluminous voice. We've heard a lot the last couple of days about the work of B.M. Slifer and his important discoveries, and also about the spectrograph that he mastered, which he used to make these discoveries. What I want to do specifically is to talk about the spectrograph in terms of its acquisition, how it was purchased in the first place, because it's sort of an interesting story. B.M. Slifer started here in 1901. Within a couple of years, as we've heard, he really got to know the spectrograph very well, and in 1904 wrote up a paper in the Astrophysical Journal describing the use of this instrument. And he just briefly mentions essentially the fact that the observatory and Percival Lowell specifically wanted to purchase a spectrograph that was very good, and they would use it, as we've heard, to do planetary research from rotational velocities and also planetary atmospheres. And that's pretty much what we usually hear in the publications about the purchase of that instrument. But there's more to the story. And I would challenge that the events that I described, if they hadn't happened like they did, we very well might not be here today celebrating B.M. Slifer's work. And so what I'd like to do is start out with a story of going back just a little bit in time, and that's to the founding of Lowell Observatory in 1894. Percival Lowell was very interested in astronomy, particularly the possibility of life on Mars, and so he decided to build an observatory. So he had to do two main things to make that happen. He had to find an instrument to use, because he owned his own telescope, a small one that his mother had given to him when he was 15 years old, and he also had a 6-inch telescope that many of you have seen displayed up at the observatory. But he, of course, wanted something bigger to do his Mars observations. And so he had to find an instrument, and he also had to find a location to set up the observatory. So in terms of an instrument, he talked to some of his acquaintances at Harvard College Observatory, E.C. Pickering and his brother William, and they let him know that there was an 18-inch telescope that was available that had just been recently built. It was built by John Brashear. And John Brashear is a really great character in the history of astronomy. He grew up just south of Pittsburgh, and for 20 years he was a mill worker. So during the daytime, he would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, go to the mills, spend all day until 6 or 7 at night, come home. His wife had made dinner and also set up the little shop. They would go out there together at night till sometimes midnight or 1 in the morning, building instruments. And that was his life. And then he'd get up at 5 o'clock the next morning and go to work. And so he got very knowledgeable about instrument building, and in the mid-1890s had built this 18-inch refractor that he didn't have a home for yet. And so Percival Lowell got in contact with him, and they exchanged some correspondence about setting up an agreement to where Percival Lowell would loan it for some amount of time. He wasn't going to buy it, he was just going to borrow it for a while. And there are a couple letters from the Lowell archives. I'm just going to read a couple snippets from them, but a couple things that will be good to keep in mind a little bit later. May 3rd, 1894, in a letter from Lowell to Brashear, Lowell says, "I have just received your letter of May 1st. I have looked over the article of agreement about the 18-inch and made a few changes in it which I trust will commend themselves to you. The change in Article 2 is to prevent a reparable injury from necessitating the purchase of the glass." Percival Lowell doesn't want to have to buy a whole telescope if a little smudge happens on the instrument. Brashear responds a couple days later, "I have examined your changes in the Article of Agreement. We think that your wish for the change is a proper safeguard for you, and I have no doubt you mean it the same for us. The only difficulty would be to fix the cost of the reparation of an injury on the surface, as it means the refiguring of the entire objective. But I have every confidence that we are dealing with you as one who will see that justice is done all through. So I make the changes just as you have suggested and return it to you." Keep that in mind. It's going to come back a little bit later. So they made this agreement, and he's got a telescope. Now he needs a place to set it up. And again, he talks to E.C. Pickering, who suggests, if you're going to set the observatory up, go somewhere where it's dark, higher elevation. And so Percival Lowell decides to set up in Arizona. Arizona has some high elevation, it's pretty dark. And so Douglas he hires Andrew Douglas, who had worked with Pickering on other expeditions. And Douglas's job is to take Percival Lowell's 6-inch refractor, the one that's sitting up at the observatory, take it out to Arizona, and travel around the territory, testing the skies in different areas to find the place that has the best, seeing. And so Andrew Douglas leaves February 28th, 1894, and his first stop is in Tombstone. This is that 6-inch telescope, and this is an image of some of the locals that wanted their picture taken with the telescope. And so he started out in Tombstone, then went to Tucson, and he found the conditions in Tucson weren't very good for an observatory, ironically, of course, today. Then he went up to Tempe, Prescott, and then ended up in Flagstaff. And by the time he got to Flagstaff, Percival Lowell was just about antsy to get to the observatory set up. Conditions in Flagstaff were pretty decent. Lowell said, do it in Flagstaff. I want to start observing Mars. This isn't a great picture, but the reason I show it to you is that this is the first site that Douglas tested in Arizona. It was Site 11, the 11th site of the expedition. And if you go outside the doors and look across the road, this is what you're looking at. That's that hill right there. Today it's called Mars Hill, after Percival Lowell's interest in Mars. This was a big lumber mill over here. That's the lumber mill. And so Douglas got to know the locals, and they said, hey, why don't you go up on top of the hill and set your telescope up? When Douglas first came to Flagstaff, he stayed in a house about a block from where you're standing right now, or sitting. So he tested this, and this is what this hill looks like today. That's Site 11 is somewhere, we don't know exactly where, but somewhere right along that ridge. So they've got a telescope, they've got a site. Douglas's job now is to receive the 18-inch telescope, set it up for observing. This is the 18-inch tube, and this is on top of Mars Hill. And you can't read that from back there, but this says Mr. A.E. Douglas, Tucson. Because it was sent to Tucson, Lowell thought they would probably send it up down there, so they sent the equipment there. Turns out it's in Flagstaff, so they brought it up here. Set the tube up, and this is the one they borrowed from Brashear. And they put it inside this dome. And this dome only sat on Lowell property for a couple of years, but to give you an idea where it is, most of you are familiar with the Clark telescope that sits up on Mars Hill. If you look at these trees right here, this picture was taken in 1894. A couple of years later, after this telescope dome was removed and the Clark dome was put up, you'll see that it's in exactly the same spot. They had a happy tree off right there. That's about it. So this is the Clark that came a little bit later on. So this is the inside of the dome. They not only have the 18-inch that he borrowed from Brashear, but also 12-inch telescope that he borrowed from Harvard College. And that's what he would use to do his Mars observations. So from May over the next few months, Lowell and Douglas did observations as many nights as they could, particularly looking at Mars. And then fall and winter got here, and they realized that Flagstaff gets a lot of snow. And by this time, Lowell was back east. Douglas stayed behind, and every day he wrote letters or telegrams to Percival Lowell about the conditions. And almost every day for several weeks in a row, his emails, his letters said something in effect, snowing again today. Can't even make it out of the hotel. Finally made it up the hill today, but can't open the dome. That's the way the winter was. At one point, it was so bad that one of the guys who helped the observatory, his name was Stanley Sykes, he came up with a scale of seeing, the quality of the atmospheric viewing. And Douglas shared this with Percival Lowell in a letter, January 14th, 1895. On this scale, he said, 10 is when you can see the moon, 5 is when you can still see the telescope. And 1 is when you can only feel the telescope. So the conditions were pretty bad in that winter. So with this, plus the fact that there's going to be another Mars opposition, but it wasn't going to be so favorable up here in Flagstaff, you had to go a little bit more south. In 1895, Percival Lowell made a couple of big decisions. A few. One was to acquire a new telescope, a bigger one that he owned, and was designed to do planetary research. And that is the Clark 24-inch telescope that came the next year. And this is sort of an iconic image of Percival Lowell with that telescope, taken a few years later. Another thing would be, we want to view the Mars opposition, but not in Flagstaff. Let's go more south. They ended up finding a place near Mexico City, and they ordered the 24-inch Clark. It was brought out to Flagstaff. They tested it, took it apart, took it down to Mexico for a few months, did some observing, and then they ended up coming back to Flagstaff anyways, and setting the telescope back up here. The third thing they would do is dismantle the old observatory. They don't need the 12-inch and 18-inch anymore, so let's dismantle it, take it back, and send it back east. Now this is admittedly a really bad picture, but the reason I show this is that when they took the lens out, Andrew Douglas decided, let's clean the lens before we send it back to Brashear. And this is a picture taken a few years later of this highly technical cleaning process. Here's, I think that's VM Slifer holding the 24-inch lens of the Clark. Here are a couple of buckets of whatever solution they're using, and that's them cleaning the lens a little bit later on. We don't have any pictures of them cleaning the 18-inch, but it was probably a similar process. And so they decided to clean the lens. And this is where it gets a little interesting. We got a little problem. Now, the archives of Lowell are very complete. We have letters and telegrams almost every day going back and forth between Lowell and Douglas. But for some reason, this little incident I've never found in any of the archives, and we just found it a couple of years ago at U of A archives. It's in the Andrew Douglas collection, and he was writing his reminiscences about the early days of Lowell Observatory. And there are two different things that he wrote this up. I'm going to read from this reminiscence a little bit because this is sort of the crux of the story. He says, some little time before this actual closing of the observatory and returning of the 18-inch, we decided the lens should be cleaned, and we dismounted it and took the two glasses apart and washed them carefully with alcohol. Our alcohol supply gave out, and we sent somebody down to the drugstore for more. He came back with a bottle, and afterwards we found it was wood alcohol, which was impure. During the process of cleaning, the concave lens was lying flat, as some of the alcohol, supposedly of the same character that we had been using, was poured on the depressed surface. While we were working on the other glass, this evaporated very slightly, and eventually we discovered on the glass a very faint line engraved just where the edge of the alcohol had stood. Such a marking constituted definite injury to the lens, for it was a permanent mark on the lens which any purchaser might severely criticize. Remember the agreement they had earlier on. Accordingly, many letters passed between Mr. Lowell and Brashear, although we don't seem to have those. Mr. Lowell had been a businessman and wanted to settle the matter promptly and without uncertainty. And of course, he also had a real obligation to make the injury good. Accordingly, he sent Alvin Clark of the great company of lens makers in Cambridge with me to visit Brashear's works in Pittsburgh and settle the payment to be made for this injury. On the trip down, I was amazed to find the celebrated lens maker spending the evening quoting Shakespeare to me. The next day, we spent at Brashear's work, and I learned that he was a great deal of an artist in many ways, as perhaps every creative genius is. At any rate, Brashear did not want to settle the matter by check at the time because it would have him to make a gamble and would not promote good work. However, after talking with him further, he finally left it in the hands of his son-in-law, McDowell, who told me that $400 would do his settlement. We went back with this information, and Mr. Lowell sent a check for $400 to Brashear, who promptly tore it up. And then Douglas goes on to wonder what would have happened if they had sent the check to McDowell, who made the original agreement, instead of Brashear. That probably would have been the end of it. But at any rate, Brashear was not, for whatever reason, didn't agree with this. So several years passed, and I always remember that debt to Brashear. And later, near 1900, when we had another telescope, the Clark, I suggested to Mr. Lowell that he give a carte blanche order for a spectrograph which Brashear could make as elaborate as he pleased, thus compensating for the injury to the lens and closing the debt forever. And so that is the story of how they got the spectrograph. There's, of course, Percival Lowell wanted to have a spectrograph. This is a picture of it on the Clark telescope. But it's unlikely they would have ordered one, at least of that quality, without that debt that Percival Lowell felt he had to pay. Just an added note to that, I'm going to go back to Andrew Douglas again. Andrew Douglas helped Percival Lowell found the observatory. But there's another kind of neat part of the story that I think is worth remembering. In 1901, V.M. Slifer graduated with an A.D. in mechanics and astronomy from Indiana University. Well, also in 1901, in March, Andrew Douglas wrote a letter to William Putnam, our current trustee's grandfather. Percival Lowell had been out of action for a couple of years. He had a nervous breakdown. And so William Putnam was sort of overseeing the operation of the place. Douglas, for the last couple of years, had been, having his doubts about the canals and the validity of them. And he was doing a lot of tests about whether they were real or not. And he ended up writing a very long letter to William Putnam saying, while I respect Percival Lowell as a scientist and a person, a lot of people don't. And they're seeing that, essentially he's a crackpot. These canals aren't real. This is why. And in July, a couple months later, Andrew Douglas is no longer employed in Lowell Observatory. And as David Dvorkin pointed out yesterday, something to the effect of seeing the canals as perhaps a requirement of employment at Lowell Observatory. So Douglas was gone. He had been doing all this work to get the spectrograph here, and now the guy who's going to use it is gone. Just at this time, Lowell gets a letter from Wilbur Coxwell of Indiana, who was working with V.M. Slifer, and said, I've got this student, he needs a job, how'd you like to hire him? Well, Douglas had just been let go. Percival Lowell was pretty skeptical about hiring somebody else, but he wrote this letter and said, Percival Lowell said, I shall be happy to have him come when he is ready. I've decided, however, that I shall not want another permanent assistant. Of course, he stayed there for more than half a century after that. And take him only because I promised to do so and for the term suggested. What it was escapes my memory. If owing to this decision, he prefers not to come, let him please himself. Percival's not really that interested in having him come, but fine. He'll help his friend out. So two events. That thing that happened with the telescope, and also if Douglas hadn't been so outspoken about the canals, if he had been perhaps more like V.M. Slifer and quiet about it, he probably would have stayed working at the observatory. He's the one that would use the spectrograph. Slifer probably would have been hired, and we wouldn't be here today. So that's a little bit about the acquisition of the Lowell spectrograph. Thanks.
Question?
Yes, Andy.
Am I right that there are two spectrographs? Is this the same one that we saw in Laird's?
Right. They when he borrowed the 18-inch, he also borrowed a spectrograph from, or spectroscope from Brashear. This is the classic one that was built that's on display. But they had other ones that Stanley Sykes and others kind of tweaked through the years also.
Okay.
But this is sort of the, there's so many components to it, depending on which picture you look at, it looks a little bit different.
David?
Yeah, just curious, in some of the shots from yesterday, and I didn't see it here, the spectrograph is cloaked in a blanket, a thermal blanket.
Yes.
Was that standard? Any chance that those blankets still exist?
As far as Antoinette may answer that, I've never seen them. There's that blanket and a whole wooden case that went around it. Mm-hmm. And I've never seen any evidence of that or the remains of the case or anything. But yeah, there's some classic pictures where they have it set up. And there was a solar eclipse in the 1920s that there's a picture of that thing attached with that blanket thing on it also.
Yeah.
Yes?
That goes back to a question that I was going to ask Laird, is how did he do the temperature stability? How did they handle that back then? What did they do? You just put a cape over it and that's temperature stable?
It may be, yeah, just the insulation.
Okay.
These days you use some circulating, but it may be that just thermal insulation would do the trick.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.